Recently, I built a bed using this bed rail hardware, and I asked if anybody would want a longer video showing how I install it. So here it is. The first thing to do is make a jig that's the exact size as the hardware. You can use calipers to get the thickness of the hardware and then transfer that measurement over to the table saw fence. Or you could just use the hardware itself and adjust the fence until the edge is touching the corner of one of the teeth. Now rip one piece of whatever you're going to use as the material for the jig. I used 1/2 inch MDF. Now I lay the piece on top here and I could feel the edges, and I feel that these two pieces are exactly the same size, so I don't need to make any adjustments, but you might need to make some adjustments, either tap the fence a little bit in or out. Now rip 2 more pieces of MDF, and this measurement is completely arbitrary. The last step is to cut the first hardware size piece into 2 pieces, and now your jig should have a total of 4 pieces. Now I could do a test fit, and I think that's a perfect fit right there. So I got the width of the opening correct. Now I need to get the length of the opening correct. So I just lay down all the pieces, put the hardware in place, and close everything up. I'll use glue to permanently attach these pieces together, but for now I'll just use tape to temporarily hold them in place. When putting on the tape, I pull as I put it down. That way the tape will help tighten all these pieces as the glue is going to dry. Now I flip it over, put glue in all the parts, and add some more tape on the underside to pull it nice and tight on this side. While the glue is setting up, I'll make some layout lines that will come in handy when actually using the jig. I mark a line at the center point of the opening on both sides and also on the ends. Now I want to transfer those top lines to inside the opening. So I'll take a square, line it up with the line, and then mark on the inside. And I'll repeat that for all the other lines. It's kind of hard to do those narrow inside pieces, but it's still doable. You just have to hold your square on a little bit of an angle. Lastly, I just want to make sure there's an even amount of material on both ends of the jig. So I'll mark accordingly and then cut on that line. Before I can use it, let's talk router bits for a second. You're going to need a pattern bit that has a bearing on top of the cutters. And this bearing rides along the MDF, and it's what makes the mortise. But notice here I have 2 different lengths on these bits, a long one and a short one. So if I was using the long one with this template, the bearing has to ride along the MDF, and too much of the cutters are sticking out to make the shallow mortise required for this hardware. So that's something to be aware of. You have to think of the material thickness you're using and then get the appropriate length bit. The glue is set up. Now I can take off the tape and set the cutting depth. Now you may think that you want to make a mortise that's exactly the thickness of the hardware, but you actually want to make it slightly deeper. I'll show you why. Here are the 2 pieces of the hardware. When you put them together and then pull them slightly apart, there's like a 30-second gap between them. So you want to take this into account when routing the depth. I'll show you an example of what would happen if you don't take this into account. Now in setting the cut depth, I'll make sure that the bit is slightly above the hardware. Now I'm ready to cut, but the best advice that I can give is to do test cuts on scrap before you even go near your project. On my bed build, it took me 3 tries to get this cut depth correct. Now this is just a test, so I'll mark some random lines to create a guide for the jig. I placed the jig on with double-sided tape and used the lines that I marked out on the inside as a guide to line them up with those layout lines that I just made. Now it's just a matter of cutting the mortise by following the template. I'm not using a plunge base here, so I'm really careful as I tilt the router so the bit does not hit the sides of my template. Now I just need to make all those rounded corners square, and I keep the template on so I could use the sides as a guide to keep my chisel straight. The purpose of doing all this work is basically like an insurance policy to ensure your bed stays rock solid for many, many years. Which brings me to this week's sponsor, Policygenius, your one-stop shop to find and buy the insurance you need at the right price. Life insurance is a tough topic to discuss, but it's super important because mortgage payments, childcare, and other expenses don't just disappear if the worst case scenario should occur. My family is my priority, and I want to make sure that they're always taken care of. Shopping for a life insurance policy through Policygenius could not be any simpler. Their technology makes it easy to compare quotes from top companies like AIG and Prudential in just a few clicks, so you can quickly find your lowest price. With Policygenius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $17 per month for $500,000 of coverage. Their licensed agents can help you find coverage in as little as a week and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Best part? The agents can be totally trusted because they are not incentivized to recommend one insurer over the other. They work for you. There's also no additional fees, and your personal information is kept private. This is probably why they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Your loved ones deserve a financial safety net. You deserve a smarter way to find and buy it. Head to policygenius.com/3x3 or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save. And now the moment of truth. Let's see if it fits. Perfect. This part of the hardware goes into the headboard and the footboard. The mating piece that has the hooks on it goes into these side rails. You can use the same jig because these pieces are the exact same size, but you have to get a little bit creative here because it's kind of hard to hold this to the end of a workpiece. So since I know I want this mortise to be in the exact same position on all of the side rails, which is typically how you would build a bed, I'm going to line this up to where I think I want it to go and strike a line on the back edge, and I'll use that line as a guide for putting on a fence. Because I want to be able to use this jig for other beds that aren't going to have these same dimensions, I'll use double-sided tape again to attach this fence so it's not permanent. So now using the fence, I could put it on the piece and use those center lines from the inside that I marked before to put it on my layout lines, and I could do this for every single piece and it's always going to be level. But a little problem here is that it's still a little bit unwieldy to put a router on here, so I want to add some more support on the sides. To fix this, once again, you guessed it, I'll use double-sided tape. So I have this lined up exactly where I want it, and now I'll just take those blocks and boom. Now there's more support for the router and also registration for doing the rest of the pieces. Now I could put a little piece of double-sided tape on the top and the bottom, and once I put the jig over, it's not going to go anywhere when I put my router on it. The depth of cut on the bit is already set from the previous cut, so all I have to do is the same exact thing as before. Clear out all the waste using the jig, and then square up the corners with a chisel. All right, moment of truth. Let's see if it fits. Well, doesn't fit just yet because on these hook pieces there are these little bumps on the back, and I need to make some room for that inside the mortise. But while I have the router already set up and while I have my jig set up, I'm going to first cut this mortise on all of the parts. So when you're actually building a bed, your rails are going to be very long. That's why I clamped it in the vise like this. You can see when I was doing my most recent bed, this is how I held the pieces in the vise. And when flipping the board around, I made sure to orient it so that the fence was always at the top of both ends. Now for your project, all the main mortises to fit the hardware should be cut. The headboard, footboard, and ends of all the side rails. Now, once that's done, you don't need this jig anymore, and we can change the settings on the router. Now we're going to deal with the travel of the hook. So these pieces hook together, and I need to make room for those hooks in the headboard and footboard. The piece with the slots is going to go into the headboard and footboard. The piece with the hooks is going to go into the side rails, but these hooks need to be able to fit into the wood. So all you need to do is mark out all their locations with a pencil and also mark out the screw hole locations. Now I need to account for the travel of the hook. So it will go in here and then it will slide down. So I put it into the mortise and get the edge and bring it out and use that as a guide to mark where that inner mortise is going to end up. Now you can see here, you get dangerously close to where the screw hole needs to be. The thickness of these hooks are about 3/16, so if you have a 3/16 bit, you can use it, or you can use a 1/4 inch bit just as well. As far as depth of cut, you want to take into account how deep the hook will go into the piece, plus the piece that has the slot in it that will already be embedded into the wood. So you put those together and then set a combo square so that it's slightly longer than that, because remember, we routed those mortises slightly deeper. Now you can use a combo square to set that depth. And it doesn't hurt to just cut a little bit deeper. For this cut, I'm going to use my 6-in-1 trim router jig with an edge guide. I could use my plunge base for this, but I'm not going to, just to show you that it can be done without a plunge base, but it's probably better to do with a plunge base. But this is a little bit of a tricky cut. So what I did here was I marked some start and stopping lines on the edge of this board so that I know where to start and stop the cuts, and I don't go over that line and possibly go into that screw hole. So you can see I'm almost at the line there, but I'll do a test fit just so that I don't go too far. So I'll put the piece in, and I can see there's still a very small amount that I need to go. Literally the amount of space here up until that screw hole. So I'll take one more tiny little cut. Now I'll do the test fit. That is pretty much perfect. Now this whole thing with not routing into where the screw is going to go is probably like bugging you out, but it really shouldn't too much, because you're probably going to use like 1.5 inch screw. So there's going to be a lot of material for that screw to bite on, and having a little bit of wood that's eaten away just in that area is really not a big deal in the long run because of the longer screw that you're going to use to attach the hardware. Now back to the side rails and the hook pieces. Make some clearance for those little bumps on the back. So I'll just mark this by eye. These do not need to be exact at all. You just need to make enough clearance for them to sit flush. There are lots of ways to cut this. A Forstner bit is probably the easiest way, but I'll just use my router with the edge guide again. I set the bit height so that it's cutting as deep as the mortise I already cut, plus the little bumps, and then a little bit extra just for some wiggle room. With this cut, there's no need to be exact at all. You could see here that I made one that was a little bit longer than it's supposed to be, but it's really just not a big deal. And there, now it fits in perfectly. Now time to screw it all in. But first, you may see a problem here. If you were to put screws into this hardware, you're screwing into end grain, which is just really not an ideal situation. So a really easy way to remedy this is to drill a hole on the underside of your side rail close to the edge. Now you're going to glue a dowel into the hole, and when you screw this hardware into place, the threads on the screw are now driving into side grain or edge grain of that dowel, and it's going to hold way tighter than it would have if it was just going into end grain. Whenever I'm screwing in hardware, I like to use a VIX bit. This is a self-centering drill bit to make sure that the holes are drilled perfectly in the center. Now you can see as I'm driving the screw in, it's going to drill into the side grain of that dowel. I don't have to worry about the end grain problem with the headboard and the footboard, so I just use the VIX bit. And as you can see, the slot is not touching the hole that I drilled for this screw. So there's no problem. There's a very small amount of material there, but remember there's also thickness of the board that the screw is going to catch onto. Now we'll just drive those screws in, and time for the test fit. So this is actually a pretty bad fit, and I did this on purpose. I was saying all the correct things earlier with setting up the bit height for cutting the initial mortise, but I did not set it deep enough. And this is what happens when you don't set your bit height deep enough and you don't account for that gap between the two pieces. So now I'm going to cut it correctly really quickly and show you how it's supposed to fit. Now for the test fit. You might think at first that this is not a good fit because it's wobbling, but when you do it like this, you need to tap it into place. And now that is a rock solid joint. Let me compare it to the other one. See how that's loose and wobbly? And this one's solid, and for anyone who thinks I just didn't tap on this one to drive it home, so you definitely need to have that space in there. Let me show you what it looks like up close. And this one over here is basically flush with the material on both pieces. And this one, there's like a 30-second gap from the top. And that's what really creates the tightness of that joint, where it drives it through these wedges and it pulls it really, really tight. And then that bed won't wobble at all. So this just really all comes down to practice. And like I said earlier, practice on scrap before you actually go near your project. It took me 3 tries on my most recent bed build to dial in the depth of cut to make sure that I had that perfect gap between the pieces. And when I was doing all that testing, I didn't care how neat any of this was or how clean it was. Quickly just hogged out everything else with some drill bits, and that's how I was able to dial in the fit without changing my my bit and my router. So that was the most important part, was keeping that router setting. So that being said, if you don't want to use the edge guide for making the deeper mortises for the hooks, you can just hog that out with a drill bit and then clean it up with a chisel if you want to. You could also just use a chisel for the whole thing. You could use hand tools to do all this. You don't need a router. This is just the method that works for me, that I find efficient for my projects. So I hope it's helpful for anyone who wants to build any beds in the near future. I know that I am going to exclusively use this hardware on all my future bed projects that require hardware. So I hope you guys learned something. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.